Thank you, everybody, and welcome back. We're delighted to welcome you to the second panel of the day. I'm Ramya Swaminathan. I am a C3 ambassador, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I wanted to start off by complimenting the DOE and the university sponsors for what has been an absolutely thought-provoking and illuminating set of discussions to date. Let me also just quickly apologize. I'm unable to share my video feed with you today, but since my role here is really only to introduce our extremely impressive panelists and to facilitate a conversation among them, hopefully you won't even notice. The topic of our panel, our second panel today, is decarbonizing industry through technology, R&D, and deployment. And we're lucky enough to have three panelists who actually span a very wide range of experience and expertise in talking about this topic. So let me start by introducing our first panelist, Jodie Lutkenhaus. She is the holder of the Axalta Chair and Professor in the Artie McFerrin Department of Chemical Engineering at the Texas A&M University. She received her Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering in 2002 from the University of Texas at Austin, and her PhD in chemical engineering in 2007 from MIT. Current research areas include polyelectrolytes, redox active polymers, energy storage, and composites. She's received a number of recognitions globally and is the chair of the AICHE Materials Engineering and Sciences Division. As well, she's the deputy editor of ACS Applied Polymer Materials and a member of the U.S. National Academy's Board of Chemical Sciences and Technology. Jodie?
Ramya, thank you for that introduction. And I thank C3E for including my perspective in this panel. I'm going to start by asking you a question to think about. How clean is an electric car? Electricity goes in, but nothing comes out. But the car may only be as clean as the electricity it consumes or as clean as its manufacturer. In the quest to decarbonize energy, nations have been expanding the electrification of transportation and the installation of wind turbines and solar cells for energy generation. Electric vehicle sales increased by 1.5 million cars, or over 50% between 2018 and 19. The total capacity of global wind installations increased by 60 gigawatts, or about 10% during those years. The total capacity of global solar installations has similarly increased. With this immense growth, there is an increasing demand for the workhorse that enables these technologies, and that is the battery. In the case of electrified transportation, this includes electric vehicles, electric airplanes, scooters, motorcycles. We need to consider, where is that electricity coming from? Is it coming from a high carbon grid or a low carbon grid? These low carbon grids rely on renewable energy sources such as hydro, solar, and wind energy. However, rely on hydro, solar, and wind energy. But if the grid draws electricity from carbon generating power plants, then even an all electric vehicle may be indirectly responsible for carbon emissions. So one solution to this is to try low carbon solutions such as wind and energy. But even with projected demand during peak times, fossil fuels may still be needed to provide a bridge. This plot on the right shows the projected cumulative emissions for an electric vehicle under 4 different charging scenarios. Note that even for this low carbon grid, carbon emissions are still expected. So in this low carbon grid, we may use wind or solar, and that's also where you might find a battery besides in an electric vehicle. This is because wind and solar energy sources are intermittent. Using wind energy as an example, a battery is used to transform the intermittent energy generated into a DC energy source. On particularly windy days, excess energy is stored in the battery, and that can be sold back to the grid at peak times when it's needed. Without the battery, it's otherwise difficult to manage those peaks and valleys met on windy or calm days. With batteries being an essential component of electrified transportation and renewable energy, we need to take a closer examination of the battery itself. So I ask you another question. Is the battery clean? So how much carbon does it take to manufacture a battery? So it turns out the battery manufacturing is very energy intensive. Battery production is associated with 56 to 490 kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour of the battery capacity. The largest share of carbon emissions in battery production comes from the electricity used in manufacturing. Therefore, using cleaner electricity and factors can significantly reduce emissions attributable to battery manufacturing. But besides thinking about how clean is battery manufacturing, we also need to think about the materials that go into the battery. Where do these materials come from? This map shows the flow of elements used in batteries and battery manufacturing from manufacturing countries into battery manufacturing countries and out of mineral-rich countries. Most battery materials, such as lithium, cobalt, manganese, nickel, and carbon, are not easily available within the US or comprehensively available. So the prospect of domestic battery manufacturing can be challenging. Specifically, most batteries are made in Asia, signified by the green color in the ribbon. Focusing specifically on cobalt, we see that a significant fraction of cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This has presented problems because a portion of the cobalt is mined by children under harsh conditions. There's a strong push by major battery users or purchasers to address this problem through child education and shifting their purchasing dollars to cobalt that is guaranteed free of child labor. So one of the questions I asked today is there another way? What if we could design, scale up, and use batteries that do not have rare or strategic metals in the first place? What if we could recycle batteries to reduce our demand on these minerals? So as I move into the second part of my perspective, I wanted to provide some solutions that I feel excited about, how we might be able to make batteries cleaner. The most immediate and near-term solution is to power battery manufacturing with renewable energy. Battery manufacturing does consume quite a bit of electricity that should come from renewable resources. Another near-term solution is to increase the rate of lithium-ion battery recycling and repurposing. The current rate of recycling for lithium-ion batteries is quite poor. Depending on the news source, the rate can be around 5%. And in contrast, the rate for recycling lead-acid batteries, which are found in combustion engine vehicles, is 96%. So this graphic illustrates the recycling of lithium-ion batteries from cradle to grave. Materials are mined, refined, and manufactured into batteries for use. After use, batteries may be repurposed for a second lifetime, as in grid-scale energy storage, from hybrid electric vehicle to grid-scale energy storage. And at the end of life, they may be disassembled and recycled by various means. However, the method of recycling is not yet settled. For example, DOE's resale program is focused on this issue. Moving into longer-term solutions, we might be able to reduce our dependence on cobalt or other metals or other strategic metals by going to low cobalt or even no cobalt chemistries. This solution might require identifying and promoting the use of battery chemistries that may be considered organic. These would be redox active organic batteries relying on materials that are comprised of the same elements that facilitate life: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. The challenge is to identify organic compounds that are just as active as the inorganic battery materials that we use now. Currently, organic batteries cannot match the specific energies that we currently enjoy with lithium-ion batteries. And to that end, myself and other researchers are examining how to increase cell voltage and capacity so it can be more competitive. The final solution I want to talk about that I feel interested in is the idea of using an aqueous electrolyte. In this idea, we would replace the volatile or flammable battery electrolyte with a water-based electrolyte. This would enhance battery safety and it would reduce organic solvent handling and environmental impact. However, current aqueous electrolytes, with the most promising being the water and salt electrolyte, have smaller potential windows and thus lower specific energy relative to today's lithium-ion batteries. And this provides motivation to researchers to widen that potential window. So with these solutions towards making batteries cleaner, we may be able to further facilitate the decarbonization of energy. So to summarize, there's exciting work going on near term and long term, and there are continual opportunities as scientists and engineers to make a difference. As a parting thought, I think that the decarbonization of energy necessitates that we take a hard look at the carbon footprint of battery manufacturing and battery charging. Thank you.
Jodie, thank you. That was very interesting, and I really look forward to the questions that we're going to get about your talk. Let's switch to our second panelist. Johanna Doyle is passionate about championing technologies that can get us to net zero as efficiently as possible. As head of commercial delivery at Reactive Technologies, Johanna works with transmission and distribution system operators across the world to deploy groundbreaking grid data and measurement services. These services give system operators the tools they need to manage low inertia, low carbon grids. Johanna believes strongly that deploying a coalition of technologies is the foundation for transforming how we generate, consume, and distribute energy. Prior to Reactive, Johanna developed renewable energy projects at RES, a leading independent developer of wind, solar, and storage projects internationally. Driven by a desire to be a part of the shift towards a more sustainable future, Johanna has an MSc in Renewable Energy Systems Technology from Loughborough University and a BA in Earth Sciences from Harvard University. Johanna?
Thank you, Ramya, and thanks, Jodie, for a really interesting first presentation to kick off the panel. So, hi, everybody, and in my introduction today, I'm going to talk about a bit more about those challenges around system inertia and the consequences of integrating large amounts of renewables onto electricity networks. And I'm going to share some experiences from our learnings in the UK. So I'm going to start with a statistic, and that is that in the UK, the cost of managing inertia and system stability has been increasing on average by 88% year on year since 2016. In the first 5 months of 2020, the costs were at 85% of the total spend of 2019. So 2020 looks set to follow the same trend. These costs are the cost of actions taken by the transmission system operator in the UK, who is National Grid's ESO. And these are actions that they take to balance the system and keep the grid secure. The increased cost to manage the system is a reflection of just how much the grid has changed in the same period since 2016. There are the obvious changes we're all familiar with, and that's the integration of large-scale renewables, offshore wind in particular, offshore and onshore wind in particular here in the UK. And then also the connection of renewable energy and other generation types like CHP plants into the distribution network. So there's now some of the generation is moving from the transmission network down into the distribution network. We're also seeing the electrification of heat and transport. And these changes are fundamentally changing the backbone of the grid and how the grid itself operates and behaves. The less obvious and consequential changes of the energy transition are also now starting to materialize in the UK and in other markets around the world, where there are high levels of penetration of renewable energy. And this is in system stability issues, things like the trend of declining inertia and increasing frequency volatility. So every grid has a stable operating frequency level. In the US, it's a band around 60 hertz plus or minus. And in Europe, it's 50 hertz plus or minus. And it's the system operator's job in every country and every electricity network to ensure that frequency never hits the upper or lower threshold of that band. They do this by ensuring that supply and demand are matched on a second by second basis. And so long as supply and demand are even, then frequency will just carry on at that even level. As soon as something happens, like if a power station trips, the frequency will start to deviate from that central level and will start to creep towards either the upper or the lower threshold. And the inertia of the system is a key determinant of how quickly the frequency moves in that case. If frequency does hit one of the thresholds, then the risk is that equipment connected to the network gets harmed, or you have the disconnection of demand or generation, causing power failures and potentially blackouts. So these are really scenarios that the system operator wants to avoid as much as possible. I'm going to use an analogy now to describe the relationship between the system operator, frequency, and inertia. So if you imagine that frequency is a skydiver on a plane, she's got a parachute and she's got a jetpack, and the parachute is the inertia of the electricity system, and the jetpack represents the interventions of the system operator. And the system operator wants to make sure that at no point in time the skydiver hits the ground. So our skydiver frequency is in the plane, something happens on the electricity network, there's a power trip, and our skydiver jumps out of the plane. If she's in a high inertia grid, she'll open her parachute and the parachute will be really big. And that means she'll fall slowly out of the plane. And she only needs to use a small jetpack, the system operator's interventions, to stop her from falling all the way to the ground. Now, if our skydiver jumps out of the plane and finds herself in a low inertia grid, she'll pop her parachute and the parachute will be really small. And this means that she's going to fall much faster towards the ground. So she needs a much bigger, more powerful jetpack to arrest her fall, to prevent her from landing uncomfortably, and to boost her back up again. So this is what we've been seeing in the UK. Really, National Grid's parachute has been getting smaller and smaller over the years, and they're needing to invest in a bigger and bigger jetpack to keep the grid secure, making sure that frequency never hits one of those thresholds. And the grid's parachute is getting smaller because, representing inertia, thermal plant is being replaced by renewable energy, and thermal plant, anything connected to the grid with a large spinning mass, such as a turbine or a motor, these are the things that give inertia to the electricity system. It's like a free byproduct of generation from steam-fired plants or gas plants, coal plants. And as those generators are being displaced by renewable energy, the inertia on the system is falling. And this is because renewable energy assets don't synchronize with the grid and they don't provide inertia in the same way that fossil generators do. So this is why we see this relationship between decarbonization and declining inertia and declining system stability. And once inertia starts to reduce, then the frequency moves a lot faster when something happens on the grid. It's also why we see one of the interventions of the system operator, if they forecast or if they see that they have low inertia conditions and they're worried about frequency moving quickly, one of the interventions they might take is to curtail wind and solar. So to ask wind and solar to stop generating and to instruct on gas or coal instead. And this is purely with the objective of increasing the inertia on the system to give themselves some headroom in case something happens on the system. So this is good from a security perspective. However, it comes at a financial cost and it also increases carbon. A further complication for the system operator, and this applies to National Grid and it applies to other system operators around the world, is that they don't actually know how big their parachute is. So system operators estimate inertia using models which are built on a set of assumptions. However, these models are known to contain errors. And as more generation connects to the distribution level, they start to take on more error in those assumptions as it becomes harder for the system operator at the transmission level to be able to understand what's happening at the distribution level. So there are two trends working together here. First is that inertia is decreasing in absolute terms, making the job of frequency containment more difficult and more expensive. And secondly, the same trend of the energy transition is also undermining the credibility of the models that the system operator is relying on in order to keep their system secure. So they're really difficult. This puts the system operator in a really difficult position because if they don't know how big their parachute is, they don't know what kind or how big of a jetpack they need to balance the system and to keep frequency in the safe area at the safe operating limit. So what ends up happening is the system operator either buys too big of a jetpack, so they have spent too much money managing a risk that they didn't need to, or they've invested in too small of a jetpack, which leaves them with an operational risk. Meaning if something does happen, there's a risk of a system risk like a like a power failure or a blackout. So neither of those things are very comfortable for the system operator, and they cut across their objectives of enabling low carbon and zero carbon grids cost effectively for consumers. So at Reactive Technologies, we've invented a method for directly measuring inertia for the first time. So this allows us to size the parachute of the grid. We've come up with an innovative approach that borrows engineering principles from the telecom sector and applies those to solving problems in the energy sector. So our R&D center is based in northern Finland, and a lot of our engineers there used to work at Nokia. So it's a really interesting perspective to come at looking at a problem in the energy sector with a completely different perspective and a really different set of learnings from a different industry. Has come up with some really interesting approaches. And our method involves injecting a tiny pulse of power into an electricity network and then measuring how that pulse travels across the network and how it changes as it traverses the network. And from looking at how that pulse gets to the end of the network from where it started and the changes in between allows us to deduce the inertia of the system. We then provide a data service to the system operator who can ingest a measurement value of their grid every few minutes, and they can bring that into their systems, into their own data management systems, which allows them to just make better informed decisions for day-to-day operations, and also in terms of planning for the future and planning their budgets and planning their markets. So again, it comes back to that jetpack analogy. What kind of jetpack do I need? What product is it? And how big does it need to be in order to manage the problem that I've got today and the problem that I'm going to have in 5 years from now. So that's the technology we're working on, and these system stability issues are definitely on the agenda in the UK. We're also seeing them elsewhere in the world, and they're one of those. It's almost like a hidden issue. It's not as obvious as the sort of first order of magnitude problem, which is building as much renewable energy generators as we can. We're now getting into the sort of second tier issues. And even that in itself is a really exciting indication of how far we've come and how mature the decarbonisation journey is getting. So Ramya, that's all I want to say for now, and I'll hand back to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Johanna. That was fascinating. Even though you and Jodie kind of come at the issue of industry and decarbonization from what I'd characterize as relatively, differential perspectives on the spectrum from research and development to deployment, one of the things I found interesting, and we can talk about it during the Q&A session, is that both of you are really highlighting the complexity of how to recognize what is clean and then how to decarbonize it in practice. And I find the lenses that you each brought to this just fascinating. So look forward to that discussion. Let me introduce our third panelist, who brings altogether a different lens and a more macro lens to apply to this issue of decarbonizing industry. So Professor Inês Azevedo is an associate professor in the Department of Energy Resources Engineering at Stanford. Her research interests focus on how to transition to a sustainable, low carbon, affordable, and equitable energy system. Her recent work focuses on understanding environmental justice and distributional effects related to energy. She's published over 100 peer-reviewed journal papers and participated as an author and committee member in several US National Academy of Sciences reports. She's currently participating in the IPCC AR6 as one of the lead authors for the energy chapter, and has received the World Economic Forum's Young Scientists Under 40 Award in 2014, as well as our own C3E Women in Clean Energy Research Award in 2017. Inês?
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see my slides coming up. First of all, I would like to thank the C3E in this amazing community, both for networking, mentoring, and just to learn about new developments, which has been a very important part of my community and own development in the last few years. Today, I'll make some remarks about issues at the intersection of energy, climate, health, and justice. So it may come as a surprise to this big gathering that we need energy for everything, about everything that we do. But energy does come at an environmental cost. We are still relying mostly on fossil fuel energy use, and we're likely to need to continue to use fossil energy use for several applications and end-use services in the many next decades to come. And so with that comes climate change as one key externality and environmental damage. And we do see that climate change is becoming one of the key issues for this generation and something that has to be tackled now. And this means that we really need to decarbonize all sectors, even those that are hard to decarbonize. So in a piece in Science a couple of years ago that actually included several of the colleagues that are participating in this meeting, including Sonia Agarwal, Sally Benson, Jessica Tranzik, Catherine Mach, Joan Ogden, Paulina Jaramillo, among others. We highlighted the issue of what is the sort of configurations that we may need for net zero emissions energy systems. And really this comes to the issue of how can we decarbonize through technology, new solutions, and policy all sorts of things, including aviation, long-haul transport, shipping, cement, iron and steel, and also load following electricity. So this amounts to a monumental amount of infrastructure deployment that needs to be performed, and an extremely challenging task. So we need to address climate change, and we need to do so under a new configuration for our energy services that will need to use different types of carriers, technologies, but at the same time, being fully cognizant that there is not going to be a silver bullet that is going to solve everything. It's not going to be efficiency alone. It's not going to be CDR alone. It's not going to be biomass with CCS. We will need a portfolio of technologies, and the window is rapidly closing. So we are all aware of the urgency on the climate change front. On top of that, there is the second externality on health damages from air pollution, among other things. And I would argue that we need to look at those two things together when we start designing policies and the implementation of technologies. And on the health damages front, as I'll highlight in a little bit, there are key and important distributional effects that needed to be taken into account. So air pollution, mainly from PM, is the largest environmental global health risk, causing about 5 million premature deaths annually. And this is due to an association with an increase in cardiovascular diseases, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and lung cancer. And so where does this PM come from? We emitted both directly from fuel combustion, as well as the emission of SO2, NOx, which can react with ammonia and form secondary PM. So in terms of just the global burden of disease, as I mentioned, we're looking at close to 5 million premature deaths, and this is both from outdoor and indoor air pollution. So these are not small numbers. Furthermore, this environmental burden from air pollution is not distributed equally across the world, or even as a function of population. So this is some work done by my colleague Josh Apte, where in the top plot we have a distribution of the population as a function of the PM concentration. And in the second plot, the attributable premature mortality as a function also of PM 2.5 concentration. And so we see that we have some regions with growing a large population that also coincide with the high concentration of PM, thus having more premature mortality associated with air pollution. So in one of our recent pieces of work, we need to tackle the question for the United States specifically of how air pollution relates to different economic activities, so different sectors, different industries. How has that changed over time? And how does that relate to the value added that we have from the economic activities that we pursue? And so when thinking about that, it's quite critical to understand which types of pollutants and where they are emitted. Because we may have like high stats from power plants that emit primarily SO2 and NOx, which will have a high dispersion moving across state boundaries. For the industrial sector, then having emissions of SO2 and other types of pollutants with medium to wide dispersion. Trucks will primarily emit NOx at the ground level, thus the dispersion being much smaller. And similarly with cars, which will be mostly in densely populated areas. So we compute the damages associated with air pollution through the use of integrated assessment models that go all the way from looking at first background concentration, well, emissions of pollutants by different sources, changes then in pollutant concentration, looking at those response functions for the population exposed to PM and converting that to the number of premature deaths. And finally, also potentially converting that to a dollar value by using a value of a statistical life. And the usefulness of that is to compare the value to that provided with services to the economy. So are we looking at a small or a big problem? Well, nationwide, the gross external damages, or GED, just from air pollution attributable to the production between different economic sectors in the US has decreased by 22%, from over $1 trillion to $790 billion over the course of just 6 years. This is a tremendous improvement, and we'll see in a little bit what are the reasons for this decrease. I was asking, are those small or big numbers? Well, these damages from air pollution alone, so this does not include climate change, comprise close to 6% of GDP. So if we compare the magnitude of these health damages in premature mortality to the GDP, they were close to 6% in 2008 and decreased over time to be a little bit over 4% in 2014. So these are not small numbers when compared to the overall economic activities. But the good news is that the US continues on its path to become less pollution intensive. Now, as we think about policies and where the air pollution control efforts should be pursued, we find that 75% of the gross external damages from air pollution occur in just 4 sectors of the economy: agriculture, utilities, manufacturing, and transportation. Indeed, I'll shed some lights on how the gross external damages map out to the different economic sectors, which are listed below: agriculture, utilities, manufacturing, transportation, and all other 16 sectors combined, how this has evolved from 2008 to 2014, and the species of the type of pollutant that is inducing the formation of PM 2.5. So importantly, we see falling damages across all the sectors. And the utility sector specifically saw a decrease in damages of more than 50% over just a 6-year period, which is fascinating. This is due mostly to the retirement of coal power plants, the transition to natural gas, as well as to some extent renewables. Surprising to us, agriculture is now the sector with the largest gross external damages from air pollution in the US economy. And this comes really from livestock emissions and fertilizer application as the primary contributors. And all other sectors of the economy combined have the same magnitude of the damages as the top 4 sectors. Now, how efficient are we at producing these goods and services that are used by the US economy? In this plot, we compare the gross external damages from air pollution to the value added. And so ideally at the margin, we'll like the value added from those goods and services to be larger than the gross external damages they impose on society. And again, I'll reiterate that we're not including climate change damages in this plot. So that would amplify even further the total damages associated with production. And so we observed that at least one of the subsectors, farms, has gross external damages that are larger than the value added. So does this mean that we should stop eating and that we don't need food? Obviously not, but it does mean that there are inefficiencies in the ways we're providing food and the ways farms are operating that potentially are cost effective as a way to reduce damages and the underlying emissions. We observed the rapid change in utilities once again, where the GED has been declining without a penalty on the value added to the economy. And finally, other changes like truck transportation, decreasing the gross external damages while maintaining the value added. I'll move on to another closely related topic. So we looked at the damages from air pollution across sectors, subsectors, and industries. The other issue is really how are some of the damages from air pollution distributed by income, race, and across states. So in another piece of work with colleagues Manny Ting and Chris Tesson and Julian Marshall, we produced the first assessment for the distributional effects from air pollution for the electricity sector in the US. And I'll jump directly to the results. This plot shows the premature mortality by race across the United States. And so first of all, the premature mortality per 100,000 people across the entire US associated with power plant emissions is around 5. But we see that there is distinctions between how this is affecting different groups. So Black and African American people are suffering a larger number of premature mortality per 100,000 people than the rest of the population, followed by the white non-Latino. Now, we may think that this sort of effect is alleviated with income. We do see that on average, as for higher income levels, the premature mortality decreases, but this is mostly associated with where people live. And we do see that even as we control for income, that Black and African American have a higher premature mortality per 100,000 people than other groups. So the size of the bubble corresponds to the population that is in the different income groups and the levels of premature mortality by income in each of the dots. Now, that's one issue associated with distributional effects. The other layer is to think about who is producing the pollution and who is suffering the effects from the pollution from electricity generation. And so in this plot, I'm showing the premature mortality that occurs in each state, regardless of where the emissions occur. So we do see that states like Pennsylvania, Texas, and Ohio have very large figures for premature mortality. Now, when we start parsing out how much of that damages is due to generation of electricity between the states, the story is rather different, right? So this is the total deaths inside the state from emissions produced in that same state. And we see that, for example, Ohio and Pennsylvania still have large numbers, but much smaller than previously, meaning the damages that occur between the state boundaries are coming from somewhere else. In the third plot, I'm illustrating the damages to others, meaning the emissions that are produced in one state, but that are leading to premature mortality in another state. And so we see that, again, Ohio and Pennsylvania are contributing to a large portion of premature mortality, which is occurring outside of the state boundaries. And in a nutshell, if we bundle all these things together and look at the net effects, we see that there are states such as New York that come out as the ones that suffer the largest amount of premature mortality between states at the expense of pollution that comes from other locations without causing damage to other states. So I'll end the comments here. So I touch upon issues related to energy, climate, health, and justice. And I'll wrap up by just mentioning that this is really an area where we need more insights to understand how to guide policies now that would lead to the anticipated effects, and that will help us mitigate the issues that we see in the environmental justice front. Thank you so much for your attention.
Inês, thank you. For those of you who were able to see the panel that just finished, one of I got a couple of resonances from Inês's talk to the themes that were brought up on the previous panel, one of which was a tremendous amount of hope and future-looking opportunity, right, in terms of air pollution actually being on a secular decline. And then the other thing I really wanted to mention as a resonance with the previous panel, Inês, and we can talk about it when we get to the discussion portion, is really about how do we internalize these externalities, right? And the nudge kind of approach, and what kind of policies are necessary to really change behavior around some of these. So we are starting to get audience questions. I wanted to encourage everybody in the audience to go to the link on your interface and type in any questions that you'd like to have answered. And I think Kelly is showing us where the Q&A is. So we welcome all your questions, and we'll do our best in the minutes that we have allotted towards the end to answer all the audience questions. I am getting us some of them, and we'll start to address them to the panelists. I wanted to start just by going back to Jodie and Johanna in the context of sort of you both coming at this from somewhat opposite ends of the spectrum, from R&D to deployment and commercialization. And I wondered if both of you, each of you, could talk a little bit about that spectrum, your position on it, where you see the challenges from moving from an R&D technology, including ones of great promise, like the ones you described, Jodie, to commercializing them. Where are the interfaces between the academy and industry successful? What could be done to make them more successful? Where do you see the challenges? I know I just threw out a bundle at you, but I'd love to hear your reactions to how we really move technologies from R&D to commercialization, because that's really where the promise lies. So I'll let both of you take that in whatever order you want to add your comments, and then please let's discuss it.
Thanks, Ramya. I'll go first if that's okay. So I was thinking about your question, and I'm coming at it more from the academic point of view, because I am in academia. But from our point of view, we're doing research at this foundational, very fundamental level where that is supported usually through federal grants. And when we find discoveries that look promising and maybe can move up along the technology level, that's when we start to think about startup companies, and there is funding in the United States for that through like SBIR and so on. But the real challenge for translating like a new battery chemistry or new battery technology upwards through the chain is that it requires a physical footprint and a supply chain. And that's a bit more difficult to put in place if you are a Silicon Valley startup technology company focused on data or computers. It's a smaller footprint. You don't have to worry about procuring physical goods from across the world in the same way. So I think for batteries, it's a unique problem to get started, because it is a bit more materialistic in that sense. And then on the technology side, for developing new battery chemistries, there is some resistance to some of the funkier chemistries, because people in general don't want to change the way they make a battery. They don't want to buy new equipment, and that's totally understandable. So I think the easiest way to penetrate new ideas, new technologies into the market is to have a plug and play option where you have an additive or a material you can switch in and out without having to build new infrastructure. So I think those are my views in that area.
Thank you. Johanna, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah. Well, I suppose this is where Jodie and I complement each other quite well, in that we're a commercial business, but with a strong R&D focus. So probably the biggest challenge for us is managing our investment in in really blue sky R&D. So someone in our research team has a really interesting technical idea that they really want to pursue and that everyone thinks is interesting, versus staying really close to the market and developing something that our customers really need. And finding the balance between those two things is quite hard, because some of our best ideas have come from that blue sky zone, which is someone's had a brilliant idea and we've done some work to pursue it and developed it along the way, versus investing in the commercialization and the production of that technology, which is quite a long road as well. It takes quite a lot to bring something from an idea to a proven product, and especially in the energy industry, our customers are quite risk averse and they like proven technology, and so there's quite a big hurdle to overcome. And I can see Jodie nodding. I can really empathize with that on battery technology as well. And once a company has made that investment, they're going to want to sell that technology as much as possible. So you have got that tension between bringing forward new technologies and earning back, a margin on the investment that you have already made. But keeping close to the market is really important, and listening to our customers and really focusing our product development on what the market needs. One of the biggest risks we carry, or any company that is developing new technology, is that you internalize and you focus on what we think is a brilliant idea, but when you come to sell it to somebody, nobody wants to buy it. Mm-hmm. So keeping really close to the customer is really essential to make sure that you succeed as a business. And then my last point, I think, would be to keep an open mind and an open perspective. What's now our inertia measurement technology started as a completely different technology. So originally that technology came from, can we send data over the electricity network? So can we use the frequency of the network as a carrier for information and for data? So we started proving that technology, and then through some demonstration projects, we realized that actually we could look at this technology from a different perspective and use it for a completely different purpose. So it's really important for companies investing in new technology to be able to pivot as well and to respond to the market needs.
I completely second that point of view as someone who's involved in commercializing technology commercially as well. So absolutely. I have a specific question for you, Johanna, from the audience. The specific question is, at roughly what percentage of renewable energy grid penetration would you anticipate the need for grid stability solutions that you described? And maybe the general question underpinning that is, generally, what are the conditions under which low inertial grids result? What kind of markets are you looking for that give rise to the specific low inertia conditions that really become a problem in terms of the size of the parachute and the need for the jetpack?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. It's hard to pinpoint an exact percentage. But ballpark, it's definitely over 15%-ish. Once you get over about 15%, you'll start to experience some of the stability issues that I've been talking about earlier. In the UK, this year, we got up to over 40% of renewable energy contribution. And back in 2016, it was around 25%. So National Grid was already spending quite some money in 2016, but the change from 2016 to now has been from about 25% to, on average, probably 35 to 40% now. And then the second piece about the conditions, 2020 has been a fascinating year for grid stability. for anybody interested in this specific area of the energy sector. And it's because of COVID and lockdown, grids across the world have experienced really low demand. And that has meant that renewables have contributed a greater share of energy generation, because there hasn't been as much demand, and therefore renewables have taken the lead. So grids have been faced with operating grids they expected to see, or conditions they expected to see in maybe 5 years from now, were experienced this year under COVID conditions. So generally it's grids where if you've got low demand, high penetration of renewables, and then also grids that are either islands, physical islands, or electrical islands, or on the edge of grids, experience stability issues much more significantly than grids that are well interconnected to other grids. So Central Europe, for example, doesn't experience much stability issues because you have a lot of grids connected to each other and they share inertia between them. Whereas places like Japan or New Zealand, Ireland, the UK, Italy, all these grids are a bit more isolated, so they're a bit more vulnerable, and can't just take advantage of borrowing inertia or stability from neighboring grids.
Excellent. Thank you. That was very helpful. I know we're running out of time. We have just a few minutes left. So I'm going to ask Inês a specific question received from the audience. And then I'll pose a question to all three of you, which is really coming back to the title of the panel today, which is Decarbonizing Industry. And I'd love to have each one of you just share a thought on what really is the most positive thing that you're what makes you optimistic about the future of decarbonizing industry from your particular vantage point. So Inês, the specific question received from the audience was that it was great information on the fine particulate matter and deaths. If you were to include vehicles in that modeling, and perhaps you did, it wasn't clear from the question, would you see different racial distribution?
That's a great question, and one that one of my the PhD students that is working with me here at Stanford, Madalsa Singh, is currently looking into, actually. No results yet, but yes, I would expect that the results will be quite different. And the reason for that is, one, where the vehicles are being driven, which will be in highly densely populated areas and in cities with emissions that come at the ground level where the dispersion is different. So the picture will be different. How different, I don't know yet.
Right, so we look forward to seeing those results when they're ready to be published. Sounds like it'll be fascinating. So let me start in the order that we originally had the panelists go for our final question, which is just looking forward and tracking back to the specific title of our panel, which is Decarbonizing Industry. What are the trends or specific happenings that you are the most excited about, that make you the most optimistic about the direction in which we're heading? Jodie?
Thanks. Reflecting on your question, I'm thinking in my lifetime, I have seen rapid growth and acceptance of the simple concept of decarbonizing industry. And I'm thinking about my two boys who are growing up. When they're my age, they may see more growth, or there may have been so much growth in their lifetime that is simply a fact of life. So I am very encouraged at the direction that we have been heading as a global society. And then to be more specific, I think the price of batteries continues to rapidly decline. And I think that is also a key feature to making decarbonization economically viable for load leveling at the grid and solar. I think we're going to see even more penetration into the market, and I feel very good about that.
Great, thank you. Johanna?
My first one was also going to be the decreasing cost of technology. So whether that's offshore wind or solar or batteries, I think seeing renewables becoming independent of government interventions financially is really exciting, and is, will really, once that hurdle is removed, they can flourish. So that's incredibly exciting. And then the second one is the mobilization of an articulate youth. I think that we've seen over the, the past while is just so exciting and so inspiring. And I mean, they're inheriting an awful mess, but I think they are, they're going to stand up for it and fight for solving some of those problems. So that makes me really excited.
Tremendous vote of confidence for the generations that follow. Thank you. And Inês.
So I'll echo what Jodie and Johanna just mentioned. We had a lot of bad surprises in recent years, and so it's good to have some good surprises too. And indeed, the rapid decrease in the cost of solar storage, and hopefully other positive news alongside technological change are definitely a positive aspect. And building on what Johanna just said, not only the mobilization, but hopefully that will be translated in a serious interest in jobs in the energy sector too, and studying different energy aspects, enabling really to make a difference very quickly.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to thank all three of you who shared such detailed, interesting, and thought-provoking viewpoints on the specific topic of decarbonizing industry. So we're just out of time here, so we'll wrap it up at the moment and hand it back to the organizers, I think, Martha.